So what I'm going to do, without further ado, we're going to read from Genesis chapter 15. And going to read the whole chapter, and then we're going to look at this passage. So Genesis 15, I'm going to read from verse 1. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield and your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me, since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abraham brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abraham drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river of the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. Amen. If I was to ask you a question, what would be the one thing you want in this life? The one thing, the most important thing for your life. What would that answer be? If, for instance, we were able to transport ourselves into a bit of a fantasy land, and we were like Aladdin, who finds the lamp with the genie who can grant 3 wishes. I wonder, what would you wish for? What would you wish for? What is the one thing that's most important to you? Is it wealth or health, happiness, power, prestige, fame, success, or none of those things? I wonder, what would it be? Have you ever asked yourself, what is it I really is most important to me? You know, I considered this question as I was preparing, and for me, the most important thing in my life is friendship, is companionship, is to love and be loved. Relationships. For me, that's the most important thing. More important than money, more important than security, more important than health even, is to know that you're loved and to be able to love someone else. That's for me personally. I'm not saying that's the right answer, and if you thought something different, it's the wrong answer. But for me personally, that's what I would feel. As we been studying the life of Abram, we saw last week that God called him from his homeland, and he began a long journey to a new land. And God made a promise to him to make him a great nation, and to bless him, and to make his name great. All of a sudden, Abraham was receiving these promises from the creator of the universe. This wasn't a genie in a lamp that you could rub and just make a wish. This was the creator of the universe coming to Abraham and saying, I will bless you. I will make your name great. I will make you into a great nation. And so began Abraham's wanderings throughout the Middle East. We're not covering the whole life of Abraham. I wish we could. It's a great subject. But between when Jenny shared when Abraham was called and where I am now in Genesis 15, years have gone by. He's been down to Egypt. He's been back to Canaan. He's travelled around and he's begun to walk in a relationship with God. And sometimes Abraham's got it wrong as well, and he's faltered and he's made mistakes and he's even sinned and he's got it wrong. But now God is coming to Abraham again, and he says this: do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. Let's just think about those words for a moment. The first thing he says is, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Now there is a sense, isn't there, that as believers in God, it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, isn't it? There is a sense that we should revere God. He's the Almighty. He's the Creator. He's the Judge of the universe. He can do anything with the word of his mouth. He can cause things into existence, and he cause things to cease to exist just by the words of his mouth. He's almighty, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-wise. That's scary. And yet he says to Abraham, don't be afraid. You see, he's speaking to Abraham in a vision. And I guess if somebody was to encounter the Lord face to face, and you read it several times in the Old Testament particularly, they felt that if they would see God face to face, they would surely die. Because here's the thing, he's the holy God, isn't he? And we see he manifests himself later in this chapter as a burning fire. He's dangerous. He's awesome. He is, in some ways, God is quite scary. And yet he says, don't be afraid. Isn't it interesting when we read the New Testament, Jesus had to say it to his disciples as well, didn't he? Don't be afraid. It is I. When they saw him walking on the water and they were afraid, it's a ghost. He said, don't be afraid. It's me, Jesus. And you know, when we are confronted with the majesty and the awesomeness of God, there should be a sense of like, wow. Because this is something beyond our normal comprehension or imagination. But God says, don't be afraid. He says, I am your shield. I'm your protector. I will keep you safe. Paul speaks in Ephesians 6, doesn't he, about the armour of God, doesn't he? And he speaks about the shield of faith, doesn't he? If you're familiar with that passage, well-known passage in the New Testament, Ephesians chapter 6. And he speaks about faith being like a shield. Not faith in faith, but faith in Jesus Christ. And here's the thing, if our faith is in God, the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, if our faith is in Jesus Christ, he will keep us. That doesn't mean to say bad things won't happen to you. It doesn't mean that things can go wrong or disaster will come near. But it does mean this, that ultimately God will keep you and protect you. And he's saying to Abraham, I am your shield. I will protect you. And then he says this, I am your great reward. It kind of covers all the previous promises. Do you remember, as Jenny was sharing with us last week, God promised him numerous descendants, a great name, blessings, and he promised him the land. He says, I am your great reward. I am the one who will provide for all your needs. God does promise to provide for our needs and more. But here's the thing, Abram was a wealthy man. He had practically everything that he could possibly want in life, except for one thing. You may have been thinking about, what's that one thing that's really important to you? What's that one thing that's key for you? For Abraham, it was to have a son. For Abram, it was to have an heir. Because if he was going to have a great name, it needed to be continued long after he had gone. And so Abraham wanted a son, an heir. And at this point, he says, look, well, yeah, this is all very good, but basically one of my servants is going to inherit all my fortune. I've got no son. And God's very specific with him. He says in verse 4, he says, you will have a son who is your own flesh and blood. He makes a promise. Not a vague one. You'll have a great name. Your descendants will be like this. You will have a son of your own flesh and blood. He's specific now. And then he does something amazing, doesn't he? He takes him outside of the tent and they look at the sky and they see the stars. Now, I don't know if you've ever really looked at the stars. On a clear night, you can see the stars, can't you? But I imagine, not that I've done it here in Chester, you'll see a few stars. But what you really need to do is to get right out in the countryside where there's no light on a clear night and then look at the stars. I've done that a couple of times in my life. I can remember actually a few years back we were camping in Cornwall. We were on Goonhilly Down and there wasn't much light pollution and we could lay on our back of a summer night and you could see the Milky Way. That's an amazing sight when you can see the Milky Way, isn't it? And there are stars that you cannot number. There are thousands and thousands, and as you look you think, oh, I can't even possibly begin to count them. And of course when we look at the night sky we only see a few, don't we? We just see the brightest ones when we're in a town or a village or a city. But I can remember the first day that I became a Christian. I gave my life to Jesus Christ about 6:30 on April the 1st, 1986. And I remember walking from my mother's house to where I was staying, and it was a clear night, and I looked up in the sky and I could see some stars. And I'm no scientist, but I know that the universe is immense. I know it's huge. People talk about different galaxies and all this kind of thing. And really, it's beyond our comprehension, isn't it? It's amazing. It's enormous. We can't even begin to fathom how far it is. They're saying, like, the stars we can see, the light that's coming, that was like from millions of years ago or whatever. It's beyond our comprehension. We can't understand it fully. Here's the thing, as I looked up at that and I contemplated that, of being a Christian just a few hours and not really even knowing what a Christian was or what it meant or what it meant, I looked up into space and I saw the stars and I thought, the God who made this, if he's really come into my life, then he can do all things. He can change me. He can help me. And that convinced me that not only did God love me, but that God could do what he promised. And I guess as Abram looked up at the stars and God said to him, number the stars. Well, you can't. Abraham saw that and he was convinced. You see, here's the thing. You might say, well, what is it that I want in life? I've shared briefly about, if you like, my hopes and dreams, the things that I value. What are the things that you really value in life? Could be a host of different things. Here's the key thing. I know what we like. I know what we want. But here is what we need. It says that Abram, in verse 6, believed the Lord and he credited it to him as righteousness. That is probably the key verse in the book of Genesis. This is the highlight now. We're coming to a pinnacle here. This is exciting. You see, as we look back from the New Testament back into the Old Testament, this is one of the most important statements that we will read in the whole of the book of Genesis. It begins to show us how our relationship with God can be restored. You remember, as we've been looking at Adam's family, we saw that Adam and Eve lost the relationship with God. That from that moment on, God was distant. God was far away. That their relationship with God was intermittent. It was dependent on a lot of factors. That it was like, you had to kind of wait for the word of the Lord to come to you. They didn't know him in the same way as it was intended. And so now, all of a sudden, this idea that is really opened up in the New Testament is revealed. That Abraham believed the Lord and he credited it to him as righteousness. This is the whole idea of justification by faith. This is the whole idea of being made right with God, of becoming righteousness. Everything was lost with Adam's disobedience, but now we're beginning to see the way back. Faith in God. The Apostle Paul quotes this very phrase twice in his letters. I'm not going to quote them because they say exactly the same thing, okay? But in Romans chapter 4 verse 3 and Galatians chapter 3 verse 6, in both those passages, Paul argues that we're not made right with God through our own effort or good works, but by faith alone. By faith. By believing in God. This is so key. People want to know, what's the secret to the Christian life? What's the secret of success? It's not difficult. It's not rocket science. You don't have to understand all the universe. It's believe in Jesus. Believe that he died for you in your place and receive him into your life. Even the youngest child can understand that and receive Jesus. He argues that we're not made right with God through our own effort or our own good works, but by faith alone. Faith in Jesus Christ. He even goes on to say that the good news was announced through and to and through Abraham in advance. If you like, this is the beginning of the gospel being announced to mankind. It's exciting. But it gets even more exciting. But because we are Western Europeans, sometimes we don't really understand what the Bible is selling, because what the Bible is saying, because what happens after this is a key event in the history of the human race. A covenant is made between God and man. You see, this is something that is alien to most of us. It's not natural to our thinking. We lose significance of this event. God made a blood covenant with Abraham, and specifically promised a huge swathe of the Middle East to Abraham's descendants. What did they do? Abraham took some animals, didn't he? And he killed them. And he cut them in half, and he laid them out on the ground far enough apart so that you could walk through the middle. To our modern minds, we think, well, that's a bit gory, a bit bloody, a bit senseless. What is the point of that? Why would you just kill some animals, cut them in half, and then make a pathway so that you could walk through it? You see, it seems strange to us because it's not something that we do in our culture. But in some parts of the world, they still do practice this whole practice of covenant, of killing an animal, shedding its blood, and making promises to one another. This was a common practice in the Middle East 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. People would make agreements. Tribes that were two different tribes would come together. They would kill animals. They would walk between the two dead animals, and they would make promises to one another that were to be kept on the pain of death. That's what a covenant meant. And so in the ancient cultures, in the ancient traditions of that time, the different nations and tribes and groupings, that if they wanted to live in peace with one another, they would cut a covenant together. There would be a sacrifice, there would be blood shed, and they would walk through it and make promises. Often it would be in the case that there would be a stronger tribe and a weaker tribe. And the stronger tribe would say, look, we'll look after you. We'll take care of you. If you get attacked, we'll come to your aid. But you have to do things as well. You have to, give us so much money a year, or it wouldn't be money, it would be livestock or whatever. And there would be an agreement between the two tribes that they would be allies together and they would be joined. And you couldn't break the promise. If one side reneged on the promise, then they would expect to be hunted down and killed. Now here is what happens. Abraham takes the animals. He cuts them in half. He creates a walkway through it, and the Lord walks through it with him. He appears as a burning fire, a flaming torch, and they walk through these dead animals And God is making a binding promise with Abraham. A binding promise. I'm not going to break this promise. It can't be broken. And Abraham too is uniting himself now to this God who has revealed himself to him. This God, Yahweh, who would become the God of Israel. Abraham is dedicating himself and uniting himself to this God. Now you see, here's the thing, and Jeff will touch on this in a couple of weeks' time. I believe this is why when God spoke to Abraham and said, take your only son and sacrifice him, Abraham didn't hesitate. It says early in the morning he got up and he went to the mountain. Now he knew this, that even though God had promised him a son and he'd received the promise, he was bound to God, to obedience to God. And he figured that even if he had to kill his own son, that God would raise him from the dead. It says that in Genesis. It says that in the New Testament as they look back at the book of Genesis. And of course, here's the thing. If Abraham was prepared to do that because of this arrangement, this agreement, this contract, if you like, that he had with God, it also meant that God was contracted to him. And you see, it meant ultimately that Jesus would go to the cross and die. And Jesus didn't hesitate either, did he? He went to the cross willingly, not under duress. He wasn't made to do it against his will. He went willingly to die for the sins of the world. You see, that word covenant, I mean, it's not a word we use much now, but a word that we are familiar is testament, isn't it? We've got a Bible, haven't we? We've got an Old Testament and a New Testament. The words testament and the word covenant, they're synonymous. They mean the same thing. They're the same word. It's just a different way of saying it. So, saying that he's made a new promise. So we've got an Old Testament and a New Testament. And if you like, the Old Testament came into being at this point. God had made an unbreakable pledge to Abraham and to his descendants. And we can follow that story right the way through to 2,000 years later when Jesus was born. But here's an interesting thing. In a moment, we're going to break bread and drink wine. Because Jesus came to bring a new covenant, a new promise. Again, started out through the shedding of blood, but this time not by the blood of animals, not of heifers and rams and goats, but the blood of Christ Jesus himself. You know, as Jesus came to the Last Supper, he said this cup, as he took the cup, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. See, now here's the thing. Abraham's covenant, Abraham's promises for him and his descendants are amazing. They're amazing. I am your shield. I'm your great reward. I will give you land. I will give you numerous descendants that you cannot number. But here is what one of the New Testament writers says concerning Jesus and the new covenant. And listen carefully. It's from Hebrews chapter 8, verse 6. This is what he says. But in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs, he's talking about the Old Testament priests, as the covenant of which he is a mediator is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. Just cast your mind back now to Abraham being called by God and the promises that God made to him. And they are amazing promises. The writer to the Hebrews says this: we've got a new covenant and it's established on better promises. Better promises. Hallelujah. We should be excited about that. We should be excited. They are better promises. And you see, I'm going to conclude now because it just automatically leads us to the table. So as we come, if you like, having looked at the word, we should be coming now with a heart of worship towards God as we come to take the bread and the wine. And we should, if you like, take hold of and appropriate those better promises.